A global political and economic showdown is beginning to take shape, one that feels less like routine diplomacy and more like the opening act of a historic clash between unequal powers. On one side stands the formidable former US President, Donald Trump, a man whose political brand thrives on disruption and unapologetic nationalism. On the other side is Burkina Faso's rising leader, President Ibrahim Traoré, a young, defiant figure who has rapidly become a symbol of Africa's determination to break free from decades of dependency. This is not just a disagreement over tariffs or a squabble about trade. This is the story of a small West African nation daring to challenge the gravitational pull of the world's largest economy, and in doing so, it signals nothing less than a seismic shift in the global balance of power. For far too long, smaller nations like Burkina Faso have stood in the shadow of decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington, Brussels, or Paris. Their futures have been dictated by policies that prioritize the prosperity of the global North while leaving African economies vulnerable, fragile, and perpetually dependent. But now, under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso is no longer willing to bow its head. It has chosen defiance over silence, resistance over submission. The young president is positioning himself not just as a national leader, but as the voice of a continent demanding fairness and justice in the international arena. The question, however, remains: can Burkina Faso withstand the crushing economic weight of America's protectionist agenda? Or will Traoré's bold gamble spark a movement that redefines Africa's place in the world? The backdrop to this confrontation was set in early 2024 when Donald Trump re-emerged on the global stage with the same rallying cry that had defined his political rise. America First. Central to this doctrine was a sweeping tariff strategy, one that sought to wall off the American economy from cheap imports, revive domestic manufacturing, and protect American workers. But this strategy, designed to reignite US industrial power, came with collateral damage. A broad range of imported goods, particularly raw materials and agricultural products from developing nations, were slapped with steep tariffs. Burkina Faso, already battling the scars of colonial exploitation and decades of economic dependency, suddenly found itself caught in the storm. The impact was immediate and brutal. Burkina Faso's most vital exports, cotton, raw gold, shea butter, and processed agricultural goods, were all hit with heavy restrictions almost overnight. These products became too costly for American buyers, choking off one of the country's most important markets. Export revenues collapsed, foreign currency reserves shrank, and the government's ability to invest in infrastructure, schools, and public health began to evaporate. Small farmers lost vital contracts, local industries faltered, and factories were forced to downsize or shut their doors entirely. The ripple effect spread like wildfire, touching every layer of Burkinabe society, from rural villages to urban markets. From Washington's perspective, this was a calculated step toward economic resurgence, a strategic maneuver to restore American dominance. But from Ouagadougou, it looked and felt like economic warfare and assault on a fragile nation for daring to exist in a marketplace long dominated by the industrialized North. For Burkina Faso, and for much of the global South, this wasn't just about economics. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and survival. And it was here, in the dusty corridors of Ouagadougou's government buildings, that one voice refused to be silenced. President Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. Where others might have accepted defeat, swallowed their losses, and retreated into quiet compliance, Traoré did the opposite. He launched a counteroffensive unlike anything seen before from an African leader in the modern era. His message was clear: Burkina Faso would not be bullied into submission. This was not just a fight for one nation's economic future, it was a battle for the dignity of the developing world. Traoré's first major move was bold and unapologetic. He went global. Rather than keeping the struggle confined to Burkina Faso's borders, he carried it straight to the most powerful international platforms, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Standing before representatives of nearly every nation, he denounced the crushing tariffs not as mere economic policy, but as a modern form of colonialism and insidious strategy used by the powerful to exploit and suppress emerging economies. His delivery was calm, deliberate, and unwavering, yet his message was impossible to ignore. Africa would no longer tolerate economic enslavement disguised under the false banner of free trade. But Traore knew words alone were not enough. Turning inward, he immediately began defending Burkina Faso's most vital economic arteries. His government imposed a sweeping ban on U.S. imports, with heavy tariffs everything from industrial machinery to processed foods and luxury consumer goods. Yet this was more than a simple tit-for-tat retaliation. Traore seized the moment to spark a wave of national self-reliance. Government ministries quickly mobilized, bringing together farmers, engineers, and manufacturers to produce local alternatives to foreign goods. It was not just a trade war anymore, it had become a struggle for full economic sovereignty. Then came what many would later call his masterstroke, the creation of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance, or CESA. This was not just another trade agreement, but a bold declaration of independence, a regional economic bloc led by Burkina Faso and soon joined by Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea. Their shared mission was clear: to build an internal African market strong enough to withstand foreign manipulation and resist Western dominance. For the first time in decades, nations of the Sahel spoke with one united voice on trade, security, and self-determination. But Traore's ambitions didn't stop at Africa's borders. He turned eastward, forging new alliances with emerging global powers such as China, India, Brazil, and Russia. Through quiet diplomacy and swift negotiations, Burkina Faso signed bilateral trade agreements that completely bypassed Western-imposed tariffs. These partnerships offered infrastructure development, technology transfers, and low-interest loans without the suffocating political conditions usually demanded by the West. At home, these bold moves transformed Traore's image from that of a national reformer into a regional revolutionary, a leader whose defiance inspired millions across the continent. But the question hung heavy: how would the West respond? Particularly the United States under Donald Trump, who was never one to stay silent. His reaction was swift. In a fiery televised address from Mar-a-Lago, Trump did what he does best: hit hard, loud, and without restraint. He branded Traore as a dangerous radical, accusing him of destabilizing Africa and turning Burkina Faso into a breeding ground for anti-American sentiment under the thin disguise of economic nationalism. Trump claimed Traore's actions threatened global markets and undermined decades of U.S. and Western aid in the Sahel region. His words were amplified by a flood of American media coverage. Major outlets blasted headlines like "Burkina Faso threatens global trade stability. Is Africa turning against the West?" and "Traore's rebellion, a new axis of resistance." The framing was intentional. Traore was not to be seen as a reformer, but as a disruptor, a dangerous outlier challenging the established global order. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, Washington acted quickly. U.S. diplomats were dispatched across Africa, quietly urging governments to distance themselves from CESA. Aid packages were reviewed, delayed, or subtly threatened with cancellation. Intelligence briefings flagged Burkina Faso's growing ties with China and Russia, warning of potential security threats. And perhaps most telling of all, American think tanks and trade lobbyists began shifting their tone. Reports circulated recommending tighter restrictions on African imports, closer surveillance of governments promoting anti-globalist ideologies, and new financial mechanisms designed to contain what they were now calling the Traore Doctrine. Traore's moves had struck a nerve far deeper than a trade dispute. This was not just about resisting a tariff. It was about challenging the very foundations of a global system built on centuries of Western dominance. To his critics, it looked reckless, but to millions across Africa and the wider developing world, it was righteous, an act of defiance that carried the weight of justice. In a political era where most leaders bend under pressure, Ibrahim Traoré emerged as something rare, a head of state willing to risk isolation, sanctions, and even destabilization in order to demand fairness. The confrontation unfolding was no longer merely economic. It had evolved into a symbolic showdown between an aging empire clinging to control and a rising rebellion demanding sovereignty. It was, in every sense, a referendum on the future of global leadership. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's defiance did not breed fear, it sparked transformation. His bold pivot toward economic self-reliance ignited a wave of civic pride not seen in generations. Across the countryside and in the crowded streets of the cities, conversations turned to independence not just as a word in history books, but as a living reality. Local farmers, once trapped by the exploitative cycles of foreign buyers, now found new lifelines in state-funded cooperatives. Corn, millet, cotton, and shea butter commodities, once undervalued and exported cheaply, were repurposed as weapons of resistance and symbols of dignity.